The first time anyone in the town of Alder Creek noticed Eli Carter was the day his house burned down. It was the last day of September. A dry, bitter wind had swept through the Appalachian hills, leaving the forests thirsty and brittle. Someone said it was an electrical fire. Others swore it was meth-related. The truth didn't matter much. By the time the fire trucks rumbled up the gravel road, the house had collapsed into a pile of blackened timber, and Eli's parents were already gone.
Eli was 5.
He stood barefoot on the side of the road, wrapped in a smoke-smeared blanket, his cheeks streaked with soot and silence. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for anyone. Just stared into the burning pile as if trying to memorize it. The town whispered for a few days. A tragedy, they called it. Poor kid. Then the whispers faded, as they always did. The only family Eli had left was his father's half-brother, Travis Boone, a heavy-set man with a mean drinking habit and a hollow laugh. He took Eli in, not out of love but out of obligation, and made that perfectly clear.
You're bad luck, boy. Travis spat one night after Eli accidentally knocked over a beer bottle.
Should have burned with that house. Eli didn't respond. He never did. Not when Travis yelled, not when he drank, not even when he shoved Eli into the drafty trailer behind the main house and told him to sleep there from now on. The trailer smelled like mildew and regret. The heat didn't work. Rats sometimes crept through holes in the floor. Eli learned quickly how to be quiet, how to take up as little space as possible. He found an old mattress, patched it with duct tape, and curled into himself every night, praying to no one in particular. At school, things weren't much better. The other kids called him names.
Trailer trash.
Burn boy. Werd Eli. He didn't fight back. He didn't cry. He just listened. Observed. Carried his worn backpack filled with books he couldn't afford, hand-me-downs he found at the county library or discarded by other kids.
Eli wasn't dumb.
Far from it. He read at a high school level by the time he was 10. He devoured books on biology, psychology, even Eastern philosophy. Anything that could help him understand why people hurt, and why they hurt others. He didn't want to become like Travis. He wanted to understand him. One winter morning, when Eli was 8, he found something that would change everything. It was lying beside a rusted dumpster behind the old church thrift store.
A paperback, torn at the spine, missing the front cover.
On the first page were the words, "Healing from the Inside Out, Understanding Emotional Trauma." Eli didn't know what emotional trauma meant. But he took the book home anyway. That night, he read under a flickering flashlight, wrapped in 2 worn-out blankets. The book talked about pain. Not the kind that came from fists or fire, but the kind that stayed quiet, deep in the chest, whispering lies like you're not enough, you're alone, you're broken. It spoke in ways Eli had never heard, but instantly understood. He read that book 100 times. By 12, Eli was spending afternoons at the public library, sneaking into psychology sections, medical reference guides, anything with the word healing in it. He borrowed old anatomy textbooks, took notes, studied pressure points, began making his own little journal filled with observations and drawings. In the margins, he'd write things like, "Anger is usually fear with a mask. People who hurt others are usually the ones hurting the most." At 13, he started working odd jobs. Cleaning the church. Delivering groceries for the one gas station in town. Fixing fences for elderly neighbors. Every dollar he earned went toward his goal, to learn how to heal. Not just bodies, but hearts. One of those jobs led him to Pastor Graham. Pastor Graham was a widower in his 70s who rarely preached anymore. He lived in a cabin tucked behind the church, surrounded by a garden full of herbs and wildflowers. Most people thought he was senile. Eli thought he was the only adult who didn't flinch when looking him in the eyes. "You're the Carter boy," Graham said the first time Eli came to clean his porch.
"You're mon meilleur fater."
He was kind. Eli didn't know what to say. Over time, Graham began inviting Eli to stay longer. They'd talk about plants, about the nervous system, about breathing exercises. Graham believed healing wasn't just about science, it was about presence. "Most people don't need someone to fix them," he said once. "They need someone to listen while they fix themselves." Eli listened. He learned to make teas from chamomile and peppermint. Learned to blend salves from lavender and comfrey. He began practicing simple breathing techniques. He even tried them on Travis once, during one of his drunk rages. Travis laughed, then slapped him. But Eli didn't stop. At 15, he applied for an early entry program at a community college in Louisville. Miss Darlene, his middle school teacher, wrote the recommendation letter. She was the only teacher who ever said, "You're going to do something important someday." He got in. Travis didn't congratulate him. He didn't even show up to the bus stop the day Eli left town. Eli sat alone with a duffel bag, the battered healing book tucked under his arm, and one clear thought running through his mind.
I'll come back. And when I do, I won't be the boy from nowhere anymore.
I'll be the one who helps others find their way out. Eli arrived in Louisville with nothing but a duffel bag, a scholarship acceptance letter, and the old paperback he'd read 100 times. The city was louder than Alder Creek faster, filled with strangers who didn't care where he'd come from or what had burned behind him. That anonymity gave him a strange kind of peace. But city peace was different from country silence. At the community college, Eli threw himself into his studies, pre-med, psychology, and anatomy. He worked 2 jobs, early mornings unloading boxes at a warehouse, late nights cleaning an outpatient rehab clinic downtown. He rarely spoke unless called on. Most of his classmates thought he was just shy. None of them knew he was carrying a lifetime of silence behind his eyes. By his second semester, he was making top grades in biology and was auditing extra psychology lectures, even ones meant for graduate students. The professors noticed. One even pulled him aside. "You have a rare sensitivity," she told him. "Not just intelligence. Empathy." Eli nodded but said nothing. He didn't have the words to explain it. He only knew he wanted to understand pain, not from a distance, not through books, but up close with his hands and presence. He wanted to touch healing, not just study it. That summer, he returned to Alder Creek for the first time in nearly 2 years. The trees were taller, but the streets hadn't changed. Travis's trailer was still rusting into the hillside, the windows cracked, the satellite dish hanging by one bolt. Eli didn't stop there. Instead, he walked past the old Baptist church, now boarded up, toward a familiar gravel path that led into the woods.
Pastor Graham Escabin.
The man had aged. His beard was whiter, hands more brittle, but his eyes, clear blue steady, lit up the moment he saw Eli. "I thought you'd forgotten us," Graham said, smiling through cracked lips. Eli shook his head. "Never." The old man leaned heavily on a cane, waved Eli inside. The cabin smelled the same, cedar wood, dried lavender, something sweet boiling on the stove. "I still make the lemon balm tea," Graham said. "For the nerves." Eli sat at the same worn table where he'd once sorted dried herbs in silence. The past washed over him like an old hymn. He hadn't realized how much he missed this, the simplicity, the quiet between words, the space to be. "I want to come back," Eli said finally. "When I finish school. For good." Graham raised an eyebrow.
Back to Alder Creek?
"To what, son?" "To build something," Eli said.
A Ellinghaus. A place where people can breathe again.
Graham didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a pocket watch, old and cracked, the glass cover long gone. "Belonged to my father," he said. "It doesn't work anymore, but I kept it." "Why?" Eli asked. "Because not working doesn't mean worthless." Eli held the watch gently. The hour hand was stuck between 3 and 4. He thought of Travis. Of Daniel, the kid at school who used to pick fights because his father never came home sober. Of the women who came into the clinic shaking with withdrawal, clutching old photographs like lifelines. Not working doesn't mean worthless. That night, Graham took Eli out to the garden behind the cabin. "Weeds grow fast out here," he said. "But if you know where to look, the medicine's everywhere." He knelt slowly, brushing aside vines to reveal a patch of yarrow.
Stop bleeding.
Helps with inflammation. They moved from plant to plant, Echinacea mullen, St. John's wort, each with a name, a purpose, a story. "This is what I want to teach people," Eli said quietly. "That healing isn't magic. It's ancient. It's everywhere. You just have to look." Graham nodded. "You'll need more than herbs and good intentions. They won't welcome you easy. Not everyone wants to be healed, Eli." I know. They'll mock you. I've been mocked before. They'll try to shut you down. Eli looked into the woods, where the shadows tangled between trees. Let them try. The next morning, before Eli returned to Louisville, Graham gave him the pocket watch. You'll know when it's time, he said. Back in the city, Eli began sketching ideas in a worn notebook, layouts for a healing space with rooms filled with light, quiet corners for meditation, shelves of herbal remedies beside modern first aid. He wanted to blend tradition and science, compassion and care. A bridge between worlds. He began interning with trauma therapists. Observed sessions with veterans struggling with PTSD. Volunteered at domestic abuse shelters. The more he saw, the more he realized that pain wore different faces, but the root was always the same: disconnection. From self, from others, from hope. He wrote in his notebook, "The opposite of pain isn't numbness. It's belonging." He planned, saved, studied, and every summer, he returned to Graham's cabin to learn more about plants, people, patience. One evening, during his final summer before graduation, Graham sat him down. "I won't be here much longer," he said simply. Eli shook his head. "Don't say that." "It's the truth," Graham said. "You'll have to carry this on. In your own way. You taught me everything." "No," Graham said. "I reminded you of what you already knew." That fall, Graham passed away quietly in his sleep. Eli buried him behind the cabin, under the dogwood tree. Just him, the pastor's old Bible, and a sky full of low gray clouds. He didn't cry. Not then. Not until he walked back into the cabin alone, saw the chair still facing the fire, the tea kettle still on the stove, and the smell of lemon balm lingering in the air. Eli stayed the night there. One last time. In the morning, he packed up the few belongings Graham left behind: the herbal journals, the old Bible, and a worn envelope labeled for Eli. Inside was a letter and the deed to the cabin. "This is your beginning," the letter read. "Not your escape." Eli looked around the room, the garden outside, the hills that rolled endlessly beyond. He knew then, he would return. Not as a runaway, not as a victim, but as a healer. Eli returned to Alder Creek in the fall, just after Graham's funeral and weeks before his final year of college. He didn't tell anyone he was back. He stayed in the cabin, now legally his, and spent most days clearing the overgrown garden and stacking firewood for the coming winter. The cabin felt quiet without Graham. Not just empty, hollow, like a house that had lost its heartbeat. Eli moved through the rooms with purpose. He knew what he needed to do. Build the healing house Graham had believed in. But first, he had to reconnect with the town that had forgotten, or chosen to forget him. He started small. He helped an elderly woman, Mrs. Lawson, fix her porch steps. Then replaced a rusted water pump for the Jacksons, who had once refused to let him on their property when he was a child. No one recognized him at first. Some narrowed their eyes, trying to place the tall, quiet young man with calloused hands and thoughtful eyes. "You're Travis Boone's nephew, ain't you?" they'd eventually say. He'd nod, but wouldn't elaborate. He didn't need them to remember who he was. He wanted them to see who he had become. Eli kept to himself but made his presence felt. He repaired broken fences, delivered groceries, checked in on the shut-ins who had no family left. Word began to spread, soft and slow, like the way fog rolls down a mountain. People started asking questions. He went off to college, didn't he? Didn't think he'd ever come back. What's he doing here now? That question hung in the air, unanswered, even as Eli quietly began renovating the church building next to the cabin. It had been abandoned for over a decade. He cleared out the pews, stripped the moldy carpeting, and opened up the windows to let in the light. He painted the front sign by hand, "The Healing House." There was no grand opening. No flyers. Just an open door and a handwritten note on the entrance: "This is a place for rest. Comme you are." The first visitor came by mistake. It was a teenage girl named Rachel, looking for her dog. She stepped inside and found Eli watering a tray of herbs on the windowsill. She looked around at the quiet space, the rugs, the warm light, the smell of peppermint and chamomile, and said, "This place feels weird, but nice." That's how it began. A few more people came. A veteran who couldn't sleep. A mother who cried every night in her car so her children wouldn't hear. A boy with a stutter who just wanted someone to read to him. Eli didn't offer diagnoses. He didn't wear a white coat. He listened. Offered tea. Sometimes just sat in silence with them. Word traveled, quietly, respectfully. People didn't talk much about the healing house in public, but they came. And they returned. Still, not everyone was pleased.
Travis Boone, for one.
Eli hadn't spoken to him since returning. The old man still lived in the trailer, still drank too much, still cursed at the television every night. But now, his name was once again being whispered in relation to that Carter boy, and he didn't like it.
One evening, Ellie found Travis standing outside the healing house, arms crossed.
You think just 'cause you went off and got some fancy degree, you can come back and play doctor?
Travis growled.
Eli didn't answer.
You're nothing, Travis spat.
Always been nothing. Pretending to be some kind of savior. You ain't fixing this town, boy. Eli met his eyes and spoke, softly. I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm just holding space. Something this town never did for people like us. Travis didn't respond. He turned and walked away, but the message was clear, not everyone wanted healing. Especially when it came from someone they once tried to erase.
The tension grew.
Some townspeople voiced concerns. He's not a licensed therapist. He's not a real doctor. He's giving people false hope. A county health inspector showed up one afternoon. She took notes, glanced around, and found nothing illegal. Eli wasn't prescribing medication. He wasn't charging money. He was offering space. Support. Still, she left him with a warning. People get nervous when someone starts changing the way things work. Even if it's for the better. Eli nodded. He'd expected this. He wrote in his notebook that night.
Opis note à service.
It's a seed.
It grow in the quai.
In spite of everything. As fall turned into winter, the healing house became a sanctuary for more and more people.
One morning, Ellie found a note taped to the door.
It read, My son hasn't smiled in 6 months. He came here yesterday and laughed. Thank you. He folded it and kept it in his journal. Then came the day that would change everything. Daniel. 8 years old. Thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes and bruises that no one talked about. His mother brought him in after school one day, saying he had trouble sleeping, trouble speaking. Eli made him a cup of lavender tea, sat beside him as he played with a set of wooden blocks. Daniel didn't speak that first visit. Or the second. But on the third, he whispered, Do you think people can change? Eli said yes. Even if they're really broken? Especially then, Eli said. Daniel smiled. He started coming every week.
Drew picture. Made up stories.
Talked about a future where he'd be a vet and have 5 dogs. His mother said the nightmares had stopped. That he sang in the car now.
Ellie felt something shift in the house.
As if Daniel's small joy had anchored something sacred. But the peace didn't last. In the middle of December, Daniel came in looking ill. His mother said he had a fever that wouldn't go down. They couldn't afford the ER. She begged Eli to help. He took Daniel's temperature, 104. Breathing shallow. He gave him fluids, used cold compresses, taught the mother how to monitor his pulse. But legally, there was little else he could do. He urged her to take him to the clinic anyway. She nodded. But by morning, Daniel was gone. The news spread quickly.
A child dead. A man with no medical license at the center.
People demanded answers. Some defended Eli, said he'd done what he could. Others blamed him. Said he'd overstepped. Said he should have known better. Eli didn't speak to the press. He sat in the healing house alone, surrounded by silence, by the echoes of Daniel's voice, by the smell of lavender still lingering in the air. He wrote one sentence in his journal. I opened a door. I couldn't keep death from walking in. The winter after Daniel's death was the coldest Alder Creek had seen in a decade. Snow fell early and thick, burying the town under silence. The healing house stood untouched for days, its windows dark, the herbs on the sill withering from neglect.
No one knocked.
No one came. Eli stayed inside. He moved slowly through the rooms, touching the spaces where Daniel had once sat, where he'd built towers out of wooden blocks and whispered dreams into the air. Eli still saw his smile in the patterns of light across the floor. Still heard the last faint breath in the quiet between footsteps. He blamed himself. Of course he did. Even though he'd done everything within the law. Even though he hadn't promised miracles. Even though he'd warned Daniel's mother of the risks. None of it mattered. A child was gone. And Eli, in their eyes, had failed to save him. The community turned. The sheriff came by one morning, awkward and cold. "You're not under investigation," he said. "Not officially. But folks are uneasy. They're asking questions." Eli nodded. He didn't argue. He understood how grief needed a target. Pain needed a villain. They chose him. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into warnings. Parents stopped letting their kids visit. Donations ceased. Eli received anonymous letters, some pleading, some threatening. One note scrawled in red marker simply read, "Leave before more kids die." So he did. In the first week of January, with a duffel bag and Graham's pocket watch in his coat, Eli boarded a bus and returned to Louisville. He didn't look back. City life moved faster than he remembered. The people were colder, distracted. But they didn't know him. Didn't see him as the boy from nowhere or the healer who let a child die. They saw a man with sharp eyes, steady hands, and a resume filled with quiet brilliance. He reconnected with Dr. Klein, a trauma therapist he'd interned with during college. She ran a non-profit clinic in the West End and remembered Eli as the intern who never blinked when people talked about the hard things. "You still want to help people?" she asked. Eli hesitated. "I don't know what that means anymore." She gave him a job anyway. At the clinic, Eli worked intake. He welcomed patients, took histories, sat in on sessions. He listened to stories of addiction, abuse, war, abandonment. He didn't offer advice. Juste présence. One evening, a young woman named Crystal came in, shaking. Domestique violence survivor. Eli stayed with her for 3 hours while she waited for a bed to open at the shelter. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. "You don't talk down to people." He almost replied, but stopped. The truth was, he didn't feel above anyone. He felt buried beneath the weight of 100 silent wounds, most not his own. But in that silence, he found purpose again. He started studying trauma therapy more intensely. Attended night classes. Read voraciously. Polyvagal theory, somatic experiencing, trauma-informed care. He began to understand healing not just as a science, but as a language, a way of seeing the body as a map of pain and possibility. And he started writing again. He kept a new journal, filled with fragments. Healing is not linear. The body remember what the mind bury. We are not our pain, but we must walk through it to remember who we are. Slowly, the heaviness inside him began to shift. He stopped blaming himself for Daniel. Not because he stopped grieving, but because he understood something deeper. He had been trying to save a life in a system designed to let people fall through. The problem wasn't his healing house. It was the fact that such a place had to exist at all. One rainy night, after a particularly brutal intake with a homeless veteran, Eli sat in the staff lounge and stared at a corkboard full of handwritten notes from patients, thank yous, apologies, desperate prayers. Dr. Klein walked in, sipping coffee. "You ever think about starting your own clinic?" she asked. Eli looked at her. "Not anymore." "You should," she said. "You have a gift. But more than that, you have context. You've been in the trenches. You know what it means when someone says they're tired and they don't mean from work." Eli said nothing. But that night, he dreamed of Alder Creek again. The woods. The cabin. Daniel's laugh echoing across the porch. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. It was time. He quit the clinic at the end of the month. Said goodbye to Dr. Klein, who hugged him tighter than he expected. "You were never meant to be someone else's employee," she whispered. "Go finish what you started." Eli packed his things. Revisited the old place. Said goodbye to the city that had held him in limbo. Then he took a slow bus ride home, not with shame, not with fear, but with a new kind of clarity. When he stepped off at Alder Creek's single gas station, the sky was gray, and the wind sharp. A few heads turned, but no one said anything. The healing house still stood.
Covered in frost, anti, waiting. Ellie unlocked the door, stepped inside, and exhaled.
This time, he wouldn't hide. He wouldn't try to please everyone. He wouldn't ask for permission. He would build again.
Brique by brique. Person by person.
Not because he was a savior, but because people deserved to have one place in the world where pain wasn't met with silence. That night, he wrote 3 words on the inside wall of the healing house, just above the entryway, carved carefully into the wood with a pocket knife.
Come back anyway.
Then he made tea, opened the windows, and waited.
The days moved slowly in Alde Creek.
People didn't forget easily, and they certainly didn't forgive quickly. Eli knew that. He wasn't expecting open arms or baked casseroles on the porch. He expected silence. He expected suspicion. He expected, in some cases, hostility. And that's exactly what he got. The reopening of the healing house wasn't an event. It was a quiet decision. No ribbon cutting, no announcement. Just an open door and the same handwritten note in the window: "This is a place for rest.
Comme à you are."
But the town had changed. Daniel's death had left a scar, and even though no one said his name aloud anymore, it lingered in every glance, every half-finished sentence, every awkward pause in conversation when Eli walked by. The first few weeks, no one came. Eli spent the days rebuilding, replanting herbs in the greenhouse, repainting the walls, replacing the tea jars that had collected dust. He cleared the meditation room and added a small bookshelf filled with titles that had helped him through his own storms: The Body Keeps the Score, Man's Search for Meaning, Radical Acceptance. He added a journal to the table by the window and wrote on the cover, "For Stories Not Yet Told." Eventually, a few familiar faces returned. Mrs. Lawson dropped off a bundle of lavender without a word. The Jacksons' teenage son Colby wandered in one afternoon, said he'd been having panic attacks and didn't want pills. Eli sat with him for an hour, taught him a breathing technique, and sent him home with a chamomile tincture. But for every person who came, 10 others crossed the street to avoid the healing house altogether. One morning, Eli arrived to find the front door graffitied with red spray paint: "Murderer." He didn't flinch. He scrubbed it off, repainted the door, and opened as usual. But the warning had been sent. It wasn't long before the tension found a face.
Travis Boone.
The man was thinner now, slower. Years of alcohol had etched deep lines into his skin and dulled his already dim fire. But the spite hadn't gone. If anything, it had fermented into something meaner, quieter. He showed up unannounced, standing in the doorway of the healing house with his arms crossed and a half-crushed cigarette in his fist. "You think you're fooling anybody?" he asked, voice raspy.
Ellie stood behind the counter, calm.
"Not trying to. This place," Travis sneered, glancing around, "is a joke.
Some hippie nonsense.
You think candles and tea are gonna fix people?" "It's not about fixing," Eli said. "It's about listening. Letting people be heard."
Travis looked. Nobody want to be heard.
They want pills, money, someone to blame. Maybe. Or maybe they just want to be seen. There was a pause. Then Travis stepped closer, voice lowering. "You should have stayed gone. People haven't forgotten what happened to that boy." Eli met his gaze. "Neither have I." For a moment, something flickered behind Travis's eyes, something almost like regret, but it disappeared quickly, buried beneath years of bitterness. He left, but the message had been delivered: the town wasn't going to make this easy. Later that week, Eli received a letter from the county health department. An anonymous complaint had been filed accusing him of unauthorized medical practice, endangering minors, and operating a health facility without proper licensing. It wasn't unexpected. He knew the limits of what he could legally do. He wasn't administering prescriptions. He wasn't advertising therapy. But the lines were blurry, and fear had a way of sharpening them into weapons. A county official arrived for inspection 2 days later. She was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. She examined the facility, took notes, asked careful questions. "Do you diagnose patients?" "No." "Do you charge for any services?" "No." "Do you advertise yourself as a licensed medical professional?" "No. I'm not." "Then what is this place, exactly?"
Ellie thought for a moment.
It's a space where people can remember they're not broken just because they're hurting. She blinked, unsure how to respond. The official left without issuing any citations. But as she walked to her car, she paused. Off the record, she said, "You're doing something rare here.
Just be careful.
Not everyone likes rare." That night, Eli sat in the greenhouse, hands stained with soil, watching the moon rise behind the mountains. He could feel the resistance tightening around him, like a storm cloud waiting to break. He wrote in his journal, "Healing threatens the systems that survive off brokenness. That's why they push back." The next morning, Miss Darlene showed up. She hadn't aged much. Still wore bright scarves and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed permission to believe in people. "I heard what they've been saying," she said, standing at the doorway. Eli nodded. "They're not wrong to be afraid. I represent something they don't understand." "You always have," she said. She stepped inside, looked around the space, her eyes softening. "This," she said, "is what we should have given you years ago." Eli felt something in his chest shift. Not quite forgiveness, not quite closure, but something gentler.
Something like grace.
She stayed for tea, asked questions, listened. And before she left, she pressed a small envelope into his hand. "Donation," she said. And a note from someone who wanted to come but didn't know how. Inside was $50 and a scribbled line, "I'm still scared. But I believe in what you're doing." It was enough.
Note to silence critique. Note to stop the letters or the glare.
But enough to keep the door open one more day. That evening, Eli stood at the edge of the garden, looking out over the hills that had once swallowed his childhood whole. He wasn't here to fix the town. He was here to be. And that, he realized, might be the most radical thing of all. The day Daniel returned to the healing house, the sky hung low and heavy. Rain drizzled in fits, soaking the earth but never quite breaking into a storm. Eli noticed the boy the moment he stepped through the doorway. It had been weeks since he'd last seen him, weeks since laughter had echoed through these walls in Daniel's particular way, half wary, half wild. Now, Daniel looked smaller. Pale. Like something vital inside him had gone dim. His mother stood behind him, soaked from the rain, her face drawn tight with worry. Her name was Cheryl. She had come to Eli once before, in the early days of the healing house's reopening, when Daniel was still having nightmares and refusing to speak. She hadn't said much then, only that doctors had given them pills and names but never answers. "He's not right," she said now, gripping Daniel's shoulder. "He's hot.
Breeding word.
I don't know what to do."
Ellie stepped forward.
"Has he seen a doctor?"
Cheryl hesitated.
"We don't have insurance. I've called the clinic. They said they can't take him till Friday." It was Tuesday. Eli knelt in front of Daniel, placed a hand gently on the boy's forehead. Burning. His skin was dry, his eyes glassy. A low-grade fever had turned into something worse. "Has he eaten?"
Notinade. Ellie exhaled.
He could hear the echo of Dr. Klein's voice from years ago: stabilize, don't diagnose. Support, don't replace. But none of that advice helped when a child was burning from the inside out and the system they were born into had no room for them. "I'll do what I can," he said. He led them to the back room where the air was cooler. He gave Daniel fluids, placed cold compresses on his forehead, taught Cheryl how to check his pulse and keep him upright. Cheryl sat beside her son, holding his hand with the ferocity of a mother who had already lost too much in life. As the afternoon slipped into dusk, the boy grew quieter. His eyes fluttered in and out of focus, lips murmuring half-formed sentences. Eli stayed close. He offered tea laced with elderflower and willow bark, prayed it would bring the fever down enough to hold. "You should take him to the ER, Eli said again gently. "I don't have a car," Cheryl whispered. "And even if I did, they'll send us home with a bill I'll never pay." Eli wanted to argue, to tell her that none of that mattered. That money was meaningless when her child was slipping away. But he knew that wasn't true. Money, for people like Cheryl, was the difference between dignity and debt, between being seen and being dismissed. So he stayed. Night fell.
Rain tapped against the windows like a clock running out of time.
Around 10, Daniel opened his eyes and looked straight at Eli. "Do you think the world is kind?" he asked. Eli's throat tightened. Not always, he said. But sometimes, yes.
Are you kind?
I try to be. Daniel nodded, then closed his eyes again. An hour later, his breathing changed, shallower, uneven. Eli knew the signs. He'd seen it before in the city, with patients whose bodies gave up before their spirits did. He called for help. Not 911, he knew how that would end, but the local clinic's emergency line. No one picked up. He tried again.
Lève ta message.
Waited. By midnight, Daniel was gone. There was no dramatic moment.
No final brise that shattered the room.
Just a quiet stillness that slipped in and never left.
Cheryl screamed.
Fell to the floor, clutching her son like she could pull him back with the weight of her grief. Eli didn't cry. Not then. He sat in the corner of the room as the rain finally broke open outside, thunder rolling through the hills like a verdict. When the authorities arrived hours later, he gave his statement with calm clarity. He explained the steps he'd taken, the options he'd offered, the warnings he'd made. They listened, nodded, took notes. But they looked at him like he was part of the problem. The next morning, the headlines wrote themselves, "Unlicensed healer linked to child's death." The town erupted. They held meetings.
Demandait d'inspection.
Called Eli a fraud, a danger, a pretender. Some claimed he'd manipulated families. Others said he had a savior complex. Few asked what would have happened if Daniel had never come to the healing house at all. Eli shut the doors that week. Not because he was afraid, but because he needed space to feel the weight of it all. He spent the next few days in the cabin, barely eating. Sleep came in fragments. Grief was a thick fog, and inside it, guilt twisted like a blade. He thought about Travis, about every word the man had thrown at him. He thought about the people who had once believed in him and now wouldn't look him in the eye. He thought about Daniel, and how he'd asked if the world was kind. And then he thought about the truth. He had done everything he could. He had not failed Daniel. The world had. The system had. The same world that had sent Daniel's mother home with pamphlets and no solutions. The same world that saw people like Eli, quiet, uncredentialed, inconvenient, and called them dangerous. Eli opened his journal that night and wrote a single paragraph. The healing house was never about curing people. It was about creating space where pain was allowed to speak without shame. Daniel did not die because I tried to help. He died because no one else would. The next morning, Eli returned to the healing house. He cleaned the space.
Lit a single candle for Daniel.
And placed a new note on the door. We are closed, for now. But grief will not silence us.
And love will not die here.
He did not know what would happen next. Whether the town would forgive him. Whether he would ever open the doors again. Whether healing was still possible in a place that had weaponized fear so completely. But he knew this, he was not leaving. He would stay in Alder Creek. Because even if they didn't want him, they still needed what he offered. And because Daniel deserved more than silence. The days after Daniel's death passed slowly, as if time itself had joined the town in mourning but couldn't decide how to grieve. Eli kept mostly to the cabin. He didn't reopen the healing house, didn't walk into town, didn't speak unless spoken to. The fire inside him, once slow and steady, now flickered without warmth. He wrote less in his journal. The words came, but they felt thin, like shadows of what they were before. Every now and then, a knock came at the cabin door. Some brought food. Others brought apologies without using the word. No one mentioned Daniel. But their eyes did. Their silence carried it. One afternoon, as a cold wind moved down from the hills, Eli heard a knock that wasn't like the others.
Tri et virap.
When he opened the door, he found Travis Boone standing there, leaning on a cane, coughing into a dirty handkerchief.
You look like elle, Travis muttered.
Eli stepped aside. So do you. Travis limped inside without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the cabin as if expecting ghosts to greet him. His eyes landed on Graham's old armchair, the empty fireplace, the herbs hanging from the rafters. This place still smells like dirt and guilt, he said.
Eli said nothing.
He put a kettle on the stove, moved slowly, deliberately. I heard the boy died, Travis said after a long pause.
People blaming you.
They blamed him first, Eli said. Yeah, well, Travis cleared his throat. people always looking for somewhere to aim their shame. Eli poured 2 mugs of tea. Neither of them reached for theirs. You didn't come here to talk about Daniel, Eli said. Travis looked at him, tired and pale. There was something new in his eyes, not softness, but surrender. I've got cancer, he said. Lung. Real bad. Eli nodded once. He had suspected it. The coughing, the weight loss, the way Travis's anger had dulled into something quieter. I don't want your pity, Travis said quickly. You're not getting it. Travis leaned back in the chair, stared at the ceiling. I've been thinkin', he said, about your parents. Eli froze. He hadn't heard those words from Travis's mouth in over a decade. That night, when the fire happened, Travis continued, they called me first. Said there was smoke, thought it was electrical. Asked me to call the fire department because their line was down. Eli stared at him. Travis looked down at his hands. But I didn't. Not right away. I waited. He stopped. Why? Eli asked. Travis's jaw clenched. He didn't answer for a long time. Your dad, he finally said, voice breaking, he was always the golden one. Smart. Respected. Your mom too. They had everything. I had this. He motioned vaguely at the air between them, as if gesturing to the invisible weight of his life. They came back to town and everyone treated them like royalty. You were just a kid, but even then I could see it. You were gonna grow up to be someone. And I wasn't. Eli felt the silence press into his chest. You were jealous, he said. Yeah, Travis said. Stupide, sick kind of jaloux. I figured someone else would call. Figured it wasn't that bad. But by the time I picked up the phone. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Eli stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the trees swaying in the wind. The sky was a dull gray, not yet storming but thinking about it. He didn't turn around when he spoke. You let them die. I didn't mean to. But you did. I was drunk, Travis said. And angry. And small. Eli said nothing. Behind him, Travis coughed again, violently this time. When it passed, he spoke in a lower voice. Ikamir, cause I'm dying. And not just from the cancer. From everything. I haven't slept right in 20 years. I see them every night. Your father, standing in the smoke. Your mother, calling my name. Eli turned around slowly. You came for forgiveness. Travis looked up. I came because I don't want to die with this still inside me. Eli walked over, sat in the chair across from him. For years, he said, I thought the fire was just bad luck. I thought I was cursed. I thought maybe God was punishing us. But it was you. Travis didn't flinch. He looked older than ever. I hate what you did, Eli said. I hate what it cost. But I don't want to carry that hate anymore. Travis stared at him, confused. I forgive you, Eli said. Not because you deserve it. But because I do. Travis blinked. His lips parted, but no sound came out. They sat in silence. The kettle had long since cooled. Eli stood and gathered some of his herbal remedies, a tea for inflammation, a tincture for sleep, a salve for pain. He handed them to Travis wordlessly. The man took them with trembling hands. Why are you doing this? He asked. Eli didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, because someone has to show this town a different way. Travis left a few minutes later. He didn't say goodbye. But just before he stepped outside, he paused. For what it's worth, he said, I was wrong about you. And then he was gone. Eli sat alone in the cabin, heart beating in unfamiliar rhythms. He felt raw, scraped clean. Like something old had finally been cut loose. That night, he lit a candle beside his parents' photo. He didn't pray. He just sat with them. With the truth. With the space they had left behind. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. Spring arrived late in Alder Creek that year. The snow melted reluctantly, and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing ground like a question, not a promise. Eli began spending more time in the greenhouse behind the healing house. It was the only place that felt alive. The soil still remembered him, and the herbs returned as they always had, slowly, steadily, without permission. He found comfort in the rhythm, planting, watering, waiting. He hadn't officially reopened the healing house, but the door remained unlocked. Some people came and left quietly. They didn't talk about Daniel. They didn't mention the graffiti or the town meetings.
Dei cam for salve, forti, for silence.
Eli gave them what they needed. But it was the greenhouse that healed him most. He worked for hours each day, hands deep in dirt, the sun warming his back. There was something about tending to fragile things that reminded him he wasn't alone in his own fragility. It was during one of those quiet mornings that he saw her, small, skinny, barely 12, standing at the edge of the garden fence with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a tear in the knee of her jeans. She didn't say anything. Just watched. Eli kept working. After a few minutes, she stepped closer. Her sneakers made no sound on the grass. When she reached the open door of the greenhouse, she finally spoke.
Are you the man who makes the place?
Eli looked up from the basil sprouts.
I suppose so.
My name's Lily, she said. He nodded. You want to come in? She did. She walked through the rows of herbs and sat cross-legged on the stone floor like she belonged there. You don't smell like hospitals, she said after a long silence. I hate hospitals. Eli smiled faintly.
I'm not one.
Good. That was the first day. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She never stayed long, never said much. But she came.
Always alone.
Always before noon. Eventually, Eli learned that her father had been laid off from the mine and hadn't left the house in weeks. Her mother worked double shifts at the gas station and slept in the back room between shifts. No one at school paid attention when she disappeared for hours. I like it here, Lily said one day, plucking a mint leaf and holding it to her nose.
It smells like when things used to be okay.
Eli didn't pry. He never asked about the bruises she sometimes tried to hide, or the way she flinched when someone moved too quickly. Instead, he gave her space. He taught her how to tend to the herbs, how to tell when a plant needed water, when to prune, when to leave it alone. You don't force growth, he told her. You create the right conditions and let it come when it's ready. One afternoon, Lily brought him a drawing. It was a picture of the greenhouse. In the corner, she'd drawn 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, surrounded by flowers. That's you, she said, pointing to the taller figure. And that's me.
Ellie pinned the drawing above the workbench without a word.
That night, he sat in the garden and looked up at the stars. It had been months since he'd felt something so simple and pure. Lily wasn't a replacement for Daniel. She wasn't a project. She was a reminder that even in a place that had broken him, something good could still grow. But good things rarely go unchallenged in Alder Creek.
It started with whisper again. A young girl spending time alone with the man from the healing house.
Unsupervised. No one said anything to Eli directly, but he felt the shift, how people turned away quicker, how the post office clerk no longer made eye contact, how a social worker showed up unannounced at his door one morning. Just a routine check, she said, flipping through a clipboard. There's been concerns. Eli kept calm. He explained that Lily came of her own accord, that she was never touched, never left unattended. That everything they did involved gardening, nothing more. Still, the visit left a chill. Lily didn't come for 2 days after that. On the 3rd day, she showed up with a black eye and a duffel bag. I'm not going home, she said. He hit me. Again. Mom won't listen. Eli stared at her, heart sinking. You can't stay here, he said gently.
Not like this.
Where then? She asked. Where am I supposed to go? It was the same question Cheryl had asked before Daniel died. Eli paced the greenhouse, thinking.
Ik knew the law.
Knew what could happen if he took her in. But he also knew what would happen if he sent her back.
Et made a call to Miss Darlene.
She answered on the 2nd ring. I need help, he said. An hour later, Miss Darlene arrived with her old truck and a warm blanket. She hugged Lily tight, then turned to Eli. I have a spare room, she said.
And a hat big enough.
Lily left with her that night. Before she climbed into the truck, she handed Eli a small paper pouch. Inside was a single seed. Plant it in the middle, she said.
so it grow bigger than everything else.
He didn't ask what kind of seed it was. He just nodded. After they left, Eli went to the greenhouse, found the center plot, dug a small hole, and placed the seed inside. He watered it, whispered a prayer he didn't quite believe in, and sat back on his heels. This wasn't about saving Lily. It was about building something strong enough to hold people until they could save themselves. The next morning, he hung a new sign outside the healing house. It didn't say open. It didn't say closed. It said, growing. Because that was enough. The sign remained on the door of the healing house, growing. Some days, people passed by without noticing. Others stopped, read it, and walked away uncertain. But slowly, quietly, something began to shift.
The story of Ellie Carter, the boy from nowhere, started traveling beyond Alder Creek.
It began with a blog post. A young nurse named Amanda, who had once stopped by for a jar of balm after spraining her wrist, wrote about the experience. She described the way Eli listened, how the space felt like stepping into somewhere ancient and safe, how it made her think about healing not as fixing, but as welcoming. The post went viral, quietly at first, then rapidly. Readers shared it across forums and social media groups. Comments flooded in.
Where is this?
I wish we had something like this in our town. This is the kind of care medicine has forgotten. By the end of the week, Eli's inbox had over 200 emails. Some were from curious readers. Some were from doctors and therapists. A few were from people who simply wrote, I'm tired.
Can you come sit in your greenhouse?
He didn't respond to most of them. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't set out to start a movement. He just tried to make a place where people didn't have to hurt alone. But it was too late for silence. Within a month, 2 journalists arrived in Alder Creek. They wanted to do a feature on the healing house, and the man who believes listening can save lives. Eli declined the interviews. I'm not a story, he said.
I'm a space.
That only made them more interested. They spoke to Miss Darlene, to some of the people who'd passed through the healing house. They spoke to Lily, now glowing with quiet strength, who told them he didn't save me. He reminded me I was worth saving. The article was published online and then picked up by a national magazine. A photo of the healing house's front porch appeared on the cover beneath the headline, The Boy Who Stayed, One Man's Quest to Redefine Healing. A week later, the town's mailbox was full. Letters, packages, requests, donations. Some brought money. Others brought seeds. One note read, Please use this to build another place like yours. My sister could have used it. A man from Montana wrote, I want to open a healing cabin in my town. Can I visit and learn from you? A trauma therapist from New York emailed to say, Your model is what our field has forgotten, presence over prescription. Eli didn't want to be a model, or a founder, or a face. He just wanted people to hurt less. Still, he began responding to a few letters. He created a simple packet titled, How to Hold Space, a handwritten guide that included principles, rituals, and reminders. Not rules.
Not instruction. Just intention.
Be present. Let people speak in their own language. Do not rush grief. Do not pretend to know more than their body does. Offer water.
Offer silence.
Offer soil if there's nothing else. People began building spaces of their own, healing corners, listening rooms, greenhouse circles. Some were in homes. Some in churches. One woman transformed the back of a laundromat into a quiet reading room with warm tea and music. None of them were exactly the same. And that was the point. The healing house had become more than a place. It had become a kind of resistance, against speed, against dismissal, against the idea that only professionals could care. But with attention came questions. Not everyone liked what was happening. A televised panel aired on a major news network. Are unlicensed healing spaces a danger to mental health? One guest, a psychiatrist, called Eli's work irresponsible, romanticized, and borderline harmful. Another, a trauma survivor, countered, he gave us what the system never did, time and trust. Eli watched the segment from the cabin. He didn't feel anger, only exhaustion. He wrote in his journal, They will try to name this, to contain it, to regulate it. But healing is not a product. It's a relationship. Back in Alder Creek, the town remained divided. Some embraced the national spotlight. Others resented it. A few feared what would happen next. But Eli didn't change much. He still tended to the herbs each morning. Still opened the door at sunrise. Still met people without rushing to fix them. One afternoon, a high school student from another county showed up with a backpack and nervous hands. "My brother came here last year," he said. "He stopped drinking after. Said you didn't tell him to stop. Just listened." Eli nodded. "What do you need?" "I don't know," the boy whispered. "But I don't want to be invisible anymore." Eli led him to the greenhouse, handed him a trowel, and said, "Start with soil." Lily, now volunteering most afternoons, showed him how to plant basil.
That evening, Ellie sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills.
He thought about Graham. About Daniel.
About Travis.
About how healing wasn't a straight line but a circle, pain returning until it was finally seen. He didn't know where the movement would go. Didn't want to control it. All he knew was that it was no longer his alone. It belonged to the people who showed up in quiet desperation and left with something like hope in their eyes. He placed a new sign beside the front gate. "Healing is not mine. It is ours." And that was the truth. He had become less of a healer and more of a gardener. Less of a teacher and more of a witness.
And the garden was growing.
Years passed. The healing house remained small. It never became a clinic. It didn't grow into a non-profit or a wellness brand. There were no franchises, no slogans, no merchandise. Just the same garden, the same porch, the same quiet room where people came to feel something they couldn't find anywhere else. Lily grew into a young woman. She graduated high school with honors, then left Alder Creek to study community health in Asheville. Before she went, she came to the greenhouse one last time. "You're the reason I'm alive," she told Eli. He shook his head. "No. You are." She smiled. "You stayed. When no one else did." She hugged him tightly and left a small envelope behind. Inside it was a folded paper with a sketch, 2 stick figures, older now, standing in a garden of wildflowers. Above them she had written, "The world needs more stayers." Eli pinned it next to her first drawing from years ago. Then he sat down and cried, not out of grief, but from the release of it. From knowing that something he planted had taken root and walked away on its own legs.
The town changed, slowly.
Not dramatically.
Not au latence.
But people began to talk about their pain with a little more honesty. The bar owner started hosting community nights where no alcohol was served. A retired nurse opened a reading room behind the pharmacy where people could sit and speak without pressure. And though the healing house never filled to capacity, its door was never truly empty again.
One winter morning, Ellie woke early to a knock on the door. Not the greenhouse. The cabin.
He opened it to find a teenage boy standing in the snow, red-faced, shivering, but wide-eyed with purpose. "You don't know me," the boy said. "But my mom said you helped her once. She used to come here after work, just to sit. She passed last year. And I didn't know where else to go." Eli stepped aside.
"Come in."
That was all it took. He was still doing what he'd always done, making space. His hair was flecked with gray now. His hands bore the calluses of seasons spent digging, building, planting. There were days when he wondered if he should have gone further, pursued a license, written a book, traveled to speak. But every time he asked himself that question, someone else walked through the door. And the answer returned. He was needed here.
Not elsewhere.
Not above. Here. One evening, Miss Darlene came to visit. They sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea. "You could have left 100 times," she said. "But you didn't." "I tried," he replied. "But you stayed." Eli looked out toward the hills, where the sun had begun to dip behind the tree line. "I used to think staying meant I had nowhere else to go," he said. "Now I think it means I had something too important to leave behind." She smiled, then reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "Graham left this with me before he passed," she said. "Told me to wait until the time felt right." Eli opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper.
Written in gras mais slow, délibérétande. The wound is the place where the light enter.
"You are not a healer. You are a lantern." He stared at the words for a long time. That night, he lit every candle in the healing house. Not for ceremony, not for guests. Just to remind himself that light, even borrowed, was still light. Months later, a filmmaker came to Alder Creek. She had heard about the healing house and asked if she could make a short documentary. Eli declined at first, then agreed under one condition: no narration.
No interview. Just the space.
She filmed for a week. Quiet shots of people entering. Of tea being poured. Of books being read.
Off en planting seed.
Of a town learning to breathe again. The film, titled The Boy Who Stayed, won a small award. It reached people Eli would never meet. And still, he stayed. When he turned 50, Lily returned from Asheville. She brought her wife, her daughter, and a small potted plant. Second-generation mint, she said. Grown from what we planted here. They stayed for dinner. Her daughter played with the garden tools. Eli watched them with the kind of awe reserved for miracles. After they left, he sat beneath the dogwood tree where Graham was buried. He brought no flowers, no speech. Just gratitude. There were still hard days. People still suffered. Some left and didn't return. Some wounds stayed open. But the healing house was never meant to erase pain. It was meant to hold it. That was enough. In his final journal, Eli wrote, "There is no fixing the human heart. Only learning to sit beside it without running away." Years later, when Eli himself passed, the town gathered at the healing house. They didn't wear black. They wore colors.
Green, yellow, soft lavender.
They filled the space with letters, memories, drawings.
No priest, no sermon. Just silence and stories.
Lily gave the final words.
Et never promise Dieu ses lignes.
He gave us room to find it for ourselves. They buried him beside Graham, under the same tree. The healing house remained open. Volunteers came and went. Lily visited often.
The gardens grew.
And on the door, carved deep into the wood where Eli's first sign had once been, someone engraved 4 words. He stayed. So we could.